Margaret Thompson had spent 67 years learning that dignity wasn't something you demanded, it was something you carried. As she approached the priority boarding line at O'Hare International Airport that crisp October morning, her navy cardigan and comfortable slacks told a story of quiet confidence earned through decades of navigating a world that often questioned her right to be there. The canvas bag slung over her shoulder contained more than travel essentials. It held the power to reshape a $4.1 billion airline merger. But the gate agent didn't see that. He saw a black woman in modest clothing approaching first class, and his practiced smile faltered. "Ma'am, this lane is for executive and first-class travelers," he said, his tone carrying that familiar current of assumption that had followed Margaret through boardrooms, country clubs, and now airport terminals. She simply held up her boarding pass, seat 2A, and watched his expression shift from skepticism to reluctant compliance. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Margaret Thompson wasn't just another passenger. She was the sole discretionary signatory for Genesis Financial Holdings, the woman whose signature would determine whether this airline's future soared or crashed. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The systematic pattern of exclusion began before the aircraft even left the gate. Flight attendant Sharon Davis moved through the cabin with the precision of someone who had perfected the art of selective service. Warm towels offered to rows 1 and 3, but somehow Margaret's row was consistently overlooked. The meal service arrived 45 minutes late, stone cold, while other passengers enjoyed their heated entrees. When Margaret politely requested a beverage, Davis claimed with barely concealed irritation that complimentary drinks weren't included in her class of ticket, a statement so absurd that even her seatmate, a businessman absorbed in his tablet, looked up in confusion. The microaggressions accumulated like storm clouds. The questioning of her boarding pass mid-flight under the pretense of weight balance, the whispered conversations between crew members that weren't quite quiet enough, the way her presence seemed to unsettle the carefully constructed hierarchy of premium cabin service. Each slight was small enough to deny, professional enough to defend, but collectively they painted a damning portrait of institutional bias dressed up as customer service protocol. Margaret documented every moment with the patience of someone who understood that justice required evidence, not emotion. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous discrimination wasn't the kind that screamed. It was the kind that smiled while it systematically erased you from spaces you had every right to occupy. As the plane descended toward Boston, Margaret's hand moved to the sealed envelope in her seat pocket, knowing that the real turbulence was about to begin on the ground. The discrimination began before Margaret had even settled into her seat, unfolding with the practiced precision of a system that had perfected the art of exclusion without ever acknowledging its existence. As she made her way down the narrow aisle of the Boeing 737, her navy cardigan and sensible walking shoes drawing sideways glances from passengers who seemed to be mentally calculating whether she belonged in the premium cabin, Margaret felt the familiar weight of assumption settling around her like morning fog. The flight attendant checking boarding passes at the aircraft door, a polished woman in her 30s whose name tag read Sharon Davis, had paused just a beat too long when scanning Margaret's ticket, her eyes flicking from the boarding pass to Margaret's face with the kind of hesitation that spoke volumes about unspoken expectations. "Seat 2A," Margaret had said quietly, her voice carrying the patient dignity of someone who had navigated these waters for 7 decades. Sharon's smile had tightened almost imperceptibly, the kind of microexpression that most people missed, but that Margaret had learned to read like a barometer of bias. "Of course, ma'am," Sharon had replied, her tone professionally neutral but lacking the warmth she'd offered to the businessman ahead of Margaret, the one whose expensive briefcase and Rolex had earned him an enthusiastic, "Welcome aboard, sir." The contrast wasn't lost on Margaret, who had spent her career in corporate boardrooms where such subtle hierarchies determined who spoke first, who got heard, and who got dismissed. Once seated, Margaret watched the careful choreography of first-class service unfold around her, or rather, around everyone except her. The warm towel service began promptly after takeoff, with Sharon moving efficiently through the cabin, her silver tray gleaming under the overhead lights. Row 1 received their towels with a pleasant, "Here you are," followed by Row 3, where an elderly white gentleman was offered not just a towel, but a choice of lavender or eucalyptus scent. Margaret sat quietly in Row 2, her hands folded in her lap, watching as Sharon's trajectory seemed to bend around her seat like light around a black hole. When the flight attendant reached Row 4, Margaret realized the omission wasn't accidental. It was intentional, systematic, and so smoothly executed that other passengers barely noticed. The meal service 45 minutes later followed the same disturbing pattern. Margaret watched as heated plates were delivered to her fellow first-class passengers, the aroma of herb-crusted salmon and roasted vegetables filling the cabin with the kind of luxury that justified the premium ticket price. When her own meal finally arrived, a full 20 minutes after everyone else had been served, the plate was noticeably cooler, the vegetables limp, the fish barely warm to the touch. "I'm sorry for the delay," Sharon said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "We had a small issue with the galley." But Margaret had been watching, and she knew there had been no galley issue. There had only been a deliberate decision to serve her last, with food that had been allowed to cool while others enjoyed their perfectly heated meals. The beverage service proved even more revealing. When Margaret politely requested a glass of the Chardonnay she'd seen offered to other passengers, Sharon's response was swift and cutting. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but complimentary alcohol service isn't included with your class of ticket." The statement was so patently false that even Margaret's seatmate, a businessman absorbed in his laptop, looked up in confusion. "I thought drinks were included in first class," he murmured. But Sharon had already moved on, leaving Margaret to sit with the sting of a lie so bold it bordered on insulting. It wasn't about the wine, Margaret knew. It was about the message. "You don't belong here, and we'll make sure you know it." The most egregious incident came during the flight's midpoint, when Sharon approached Margaret's row with the kind of forced smile that preceded bad news. "Ma'am," she said, her voice carrying the artificial sweetness of someone delivering a rehearsed script, "we've had a request from the captain regarding weight distribution. Would you mind moving to seat 17D? It's just a temporary adjustment for flight safety." The request was so absurd. Weight balance issues didn't require moving a single 130-pound passenger from first class to economy. That Margaret almost laughed. Instead, she looked Sharon directly in the eye and said with quiet firmness, "I'll stay where I am, thank you." The flight attendant's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of irritation that confirmed what Margaret had suspected all along. This wasn't about safety or protocol. It was about power, and someone's discomfort with seeing her exercise hers. Throughout these interactions, Margaret maintained the composure that had served her well through decades of corporate negotiations and social challenges. She didn't raise her voice, didn't demand to speak to a manager, didn't create the kind of scene that would have justified the treatment she was receiving. Instead, she documented each slight with the methodical precision of someone who understood that justice required evidence, not emotion. She noted the times, the witnesses, the exact words used. She observed how other passengers were treated in comparison, how Sharon's demeanor shifted depending on who she was serving. Most importantly, she watched how the system of discrimination operated, not through overt hostility, but through 1,000 small cuts designed to make her question her right to be there. The other passengers, meanwhile, seemed to exist in a bubble of willful ignorance. They noticed the delays in Margaret's service, the cooler food, the attempts to relocate her. But they processed these incidents as isolated inconveniences rather than part of a larger pattern. Some even seemed to approve, their sideways glances and whispered comments suggesting that they, too, questioned Margaret's presence in first class. Probably used points. She heard one woman mutter to her companion, "You know how they game the system." The casual cruelty of the assumption that a black woman in first class must have somehow cheated her way there revealed the depth of the prejudice Margaret was facing. As the flight progressed, Margaret felt the familiar weight of institutional bias pressing down on her, the same force that had followed her through country clubs and corporate boardrooms, that had questioned her credentials and challenged her authority at every turn. But this time was different. This time, she wasn't just enduring the discrimination, she was studying it, documenting it, preparing to use it as evidence of something larger and more damaging than personal prejudice. Because Margaret Thompson wasn't just another passenger being mistreated by airline staff. She was the woman whose signature could determine whether this airline's future soared or crashed. And every slight, every dismissal, every attempt to diminish her was being carefully catalogued for the reckoning that was to come. The pattern of exclusion that had seemed so routine to Sharon and her colleagues was about to become the very evidence that would reshape their professional lives forever. They had treated Margaret as invisible, never suspecting that she was actually the most visible person on the plane, to the people who truly mattered. The confrontation began not with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with the quiet authority of 2 uniformed officers appearing at Margaret's row as the aircraft taxied toward Gate 32. Their presence carried the weight of institutional power, badges gleaming under the cabin's fluorescent lights, radios crackling softly with the dispatcher chatter, and that particular brand of professional courtesy that masked absolute control. The taller officer, a man in his 40s with graying temples, and the measured gait of someone accustomed to difficult conversations, approached Margaret's seat with practiced precision. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," he said, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that brooked no argument. Just a few questions to clear up some concerns that were raised during the flight. Margaret looked up from her canvas bag, her expression unchanged, and asked with the quiet dignity that had served her through 7 decades of navigating such moments, "What kind of concerns?" The second officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipboard tucked under her arm, stepped closer. "Reports of non-compliant behavior, ma'am. Refusal to follow crew instructions, verbal confrontations with staff. Standard protocol requires us to follow up on such incidents." Margaret's seatmate, the businessman who had witnessed the systematic exclusion throughout the flight, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He opened his mouth as if to speak, perhaps to contradict the officer's characterization of events, but the weight of their authority seemed to press down on him like cabin pressure. He said nothing, returning to his tablet with the studied indifference of someone who had learned that involvement in such matters rarely ended well for bystanders. Margaret gathered her belongings with deliberate slowness, her movements betraying none of the tension that must have been building inside her. She had been through this dance before, the careful choreography of power, asserting itself through procedure, the way authority dressed up its biases in the language of safety and protocol. The walk through the terminal felt like a perp walk, though no handcuffs were involved. Other passengers from the flight watched with the morbid curiosity of rubberneckers at a highway accident, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of speculation that followed Margaret down the concourse. "I heard she was causing problems," one woman murmured to her companion. "Probably had too much to drink," another voice suggested, though Margaret hadn't consumed a drop of alcohol during the flight. The assumptions flowed as freely as the coffee in the terminal's cafes, each speculation adding another layer to the narrative being constructed around her. They led her to a sterile room tucked away from the main terminal traffic, Operations Room 7B, according to the placard beside the door. The space was deliberately intimidating. Harsh fluorescent lighting that cast unflattering shadows, metal chairs that offered no comfort, and walls painted in that particular shade of institutional beige that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who entered. A desk dominated the center of the room, its surface bare except for a computer terminal and a stack of forms that suggested this was not Margaret's first visit to such a space, nor would it be her last. Airport Security Supervisor David Harrison entered the room with the confidence of a man who had conducted thousands of such interviews. His badge identified him as a 20-year veteran of airport operations, and his demeanor suggested he had seen every type of difficult passenger the system could produce. Behind him came Officer Patricia Reeves, whose notebook was already open and whose pen was poised to document whatever confession or admission they expected to extract from Margaret. The dynamic was clear. They were the professionals. She was the problem. And this room was where problems got resolved through a combination of intimidation and paperwork. "Mrs. Thompson," Harrison began, settling into his chair with the casual authority of someone on his home turf, "we've received some concerning reports about your behavior during today's flight. The crew has indicated that you were uncooperative, argumentative, and disruptive to other passengers. Now, we understand that flying can be stressful, but we need to address these issues before they escalate further." His tone was patronizing in the way that certain men of his generation had perfected, simultaneously sympathetic and condescending, offering understanding while making it clear that he held all the cards. Margaret sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her canvas bag resting at her feet like a faithful companion. She had learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than speech, that letting others reveal themselves through their assumptions and accusations could be more effective than any defense she might mount. "I'm curious," she said finally, her voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chose her words carefully. "Which crew members filed these reports, and what specific incidents they're referring to?" The question was simple, reasonable, and it immediately put Harrison on the defensive. Officer Reeves consulted her notes, flipping through pages with theatrical precision. "The flight attendant reported that you refused to comply with seating instructions, became verbally aggressive when asked to move for weight distribution purposes, and created a disturbance during meal service." Each accusation was delivered with the clinical detachment of someone reading from a script, but Margaret noticed the vagueness of the language. No specific quotes, no detailed descriptions, just the broad strokes of institutional narrative painting her as the aggressor. "Weight distribution," Margaret repeated, her eyebrows rising slightly. "On a Boeing 737, you're telling me that moving one 130-pound passenger from first class to economy was necessary for flight safety." The question hung in the air like a challenge, exposing the absurdity of the claim with surgical precision. Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that Margaret had learned to recognize in boardrooms and country clubs, the moment when men realized their authority was being questioned by someone who understood the game better than they had assumed. The interrogation continued for another 20 minutes, with Harrison and Reeves taking turns presenting their case against Margaret, while she responded with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades defending her right to exist in spaces that questioned her presence. They spoke of passenger safety protocols and crew authority, using the language of regulation to justify what Margaret knew was nothing more than institutional bias dressed up in official terminology. Each question revealed more about their assumptions than about her actions, each accusation exposing the system's willingness to criminalize her mere presence in first class. The turning point came when Harrison leaned forward, his voice taking on the edge of someone whose patience was wearing thin. "Look, Mrs. Thompson, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. You can acknowledge that your behavior was inappropriate, accept a warning, and we can all move on. Or we can escalate this to a formal incident report that will flag you for additional screening on all future flights. The choice is yours." The threat was clear, delivered with the casual brutality of someone who had used it countless times before. It was the moment when the system revealed its true nature, not interested in justice or truth, but in compliance and control. Margaret reached into her canvas bag with the same deliberate movements she had used throughout the ordeal. Her fingers found the sealed envelope she had been carrying, its weight both literal and metaphorical. "Before I respond to your ultimatum," she said, her voice carrying a new quality that made both officers lean forward despite themselves, "I think you should know who you're threatening." She placed the envelope on the desk between them, its red wax seal catching the harsh fluorescent light like a warning beacon. Harrison stared at the envelope, his confidence beginning to waver for the first time since entering the room. "What is this?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he was beginning to suspect that this interview was not going according to the script he had followed so many times before. Margaret's smile was small but unmistakable, carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had allowed her opponents to reveal themselves completely before showing her hand. "Open it," she said simply, "and find out exactly how much trouble you're in." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, the kind of moment when the entire trajectory of a situation could shift with the breaking of a wax seal. Outside the room, the terminal continued its relentless rhythm of arrivals and departures, but inside Operations Room 7B, time seemed suspended as two representatives of institutional authority stared at an envelope that promised to rewrite everything they thought they knew about the woman sitting across from them. The moment Harrison's fingers broke the red wax seal, the atmosphere in Operations Room 7B shifted like the barometric pressure before a thunderstorm. The envelope opened with a crisp whisper, revealing documents that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic in the sterile interrogation space. Harrison's eyes moved across the letterhead, Genesis Financial Holdings, and his confident demeanor began to crack like ice under sudden heat. The official seal, embossed in gold foil, caught the harsh fluorescent light as he lifted the first page, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly as he read the words that would redefine everything he thought he knew about the woman sitting across from him. "Fiduciary authorization and discretionary signatory powers," he read aloud, his voice losing its earlier authority with each syllable. "Margaret Elizabeth Thompson, sole discretionary signatory for Genesis Financial Holdings, authorized to execute binding financial decisions on behalf of the Trust's $4.1 billion portfolio of transportation sector investments." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid and impossible to ignore. Officer Reeves leaned forward, her notebook forgotten, as Harrison continued reading with growing alarm. Current holdings include 41% controlling interest in pending merger agreements with Northeastern Regional Airlines, effective through December 2025. Margaret watched their faces transform as the reality of her identity settled over them like a heavy blanket. The woman they had detained, questioned, and threatened was not just another passenger, she was the financial architect of their airline's future. Every slight, every dismissal, every attempt to diminish her presence had been documented not by a victim, but by the person who literally held the power to determine whether their company would soar or crash. Harrison's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his earlier swagger evaporating like morning dew under the scorching sun of revelation. "Ma'am," he began, his voice now carrying the tremulous quality of someone who had just realized they were standing on quicksand. "I had no idea." Margaret raised her hand with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to boardroom silence. "Of course you didn't," she said, her tone carrying the measured weight of 7 decades of navigating such moments. "That was precisely the point. You treated me based on your assumptions about who I appeared to be, not who I actually am, and in doing so, you've provided me with exactly the evidence I needed to make my final decision about this merger." Officer Reeves found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Your final decision?" Margaret reached into her canvas bag and withdrew a second envelope, this one bearing an even more impressive seal, the insignia of the Federal Aviation Authority's Financial Oversight Division. "This airline's merger with Northeastern Regional requires approval from all major stakeholders," she explained with the patience of a professor addressing particularly slow students. "Genesis Financial Holdings' approval is not just recommended, it's mandatory. Without my signature, the $4.1 billion transaction cannot proceed, and your company will lose its exclusive rights to the Northeastern corridor routes." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of aircraft engines from the tarmac beyond. Harrison's face had gone pale, the color draining from his cheeks as if someone had opened a valve. He looked down at the documents again, perhaps hoping they would somehow read differently, but the words remained unchanged, immutable as carved stone. Margaret Thompson wasn't just a passenger who had been mistreated. She was the woman whose decision would determine whether hundreds of employees kept their jobs, whether shareholders saw profits or losses, whether the airline continued to exist as a viable entity. "The irony," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had allowed her opponents to reveal themselves completely, "is that I came here specifically to observe how your airline treats passengers it perceives as unimportant. The Trust's board wanted assurance that any company receiving our investment treats all customers with dignity and respect. Your staff failed that test spectacularly." She gestured toward the documents Harrison still held with shaking hands. "Every interaction has been documented, from the gate agent who questioned my boarding pass to the flight attendant who served me cold food while others received warm meals." Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The confident authority he had wielded just minutes earlier now seemed as substantial as smoke. "Mrs. Thompson," he managed, his voice cracking slightly, "surely we can resolve this misunderstanding. If there were service issues, we can address them through our normal channels." Margaret's laugh was soft but cutting, like silk over steel. "Misunderstanding?" she repeated, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Mr. Harrison, there was no misunderstanding. Your system worked exactly as designed. It identified someone it perceived as vulnerable and systematically excluded her from the service she had paid for." The revelation continued to unfold as Margaret produced additional documentation from her seemingly inexhaustible canvas bag. Bank statements showing her personal net worth, $847 million, accumulated through decades of strategic investments and business acumen. Board appointments to 3 major financial institutions, each one carrying the kind of influence that could make or break corporate partnerships. Letters of recommendation from senators, federal judges, and Fortune 500 CEOs, all attesting to her character and business integrity. Each document was another nail in the coffin of their assumptions, another piece of evidence that the woman they had dismissed was actually one of the most powerful people they would ever encounter. "You see," Margaret said, arranging the papers on the desk with methodical precision, "I didn't just happen to be on that flight. I specifically chose to travel incognito to test your company's character when it thought no one important was watching. The trust has a policy. We don't invest in companies that practice systemic discrimination, regardless of their profit potential." She looked directly at Harrison, her gaze steady and unforgiving. "Your airline just failed the most expensive test in its corporate history." Officer Reeves, who had remained silent throughout most of the revelation, finally found her voice. "What does this mean for the investigation?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Margaret's smile was thin but unmistakable. "There is no investigation," she replied. "There's only documentation. Every interaction I had with your staff has been recorded, time-stamped, and cross-referenced with your own internal systems. The pattern of discrimination is clear, consistent, and undeniable." Harrison's phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, but he seemed afraid to answer it, as if acknowledging the outside world would make this nightmare more real. Margaret noticed his hesitation and nodded toward the device. "You should probably take that," she suggested with mock helpfulness. "I imagine your legal department is having quite an urgent morning." When Harrison reluctantly answered, his face went from pale to ashen as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, sir," he said repeatedly. His earlier authority completely evaporated. "Yes, I understand." "She's here now." "Yes, sir, immediately." As Harrison ended the call, Margaret stood with the same deliberate grace she had maintained throughout the ordeal. "I assume that was your CEO," she said, not really asking. "He's probably just learned that Genesis Financial Holdings has initiated a formal review of all investment partnerships with companies that have demonstrated patterns of discriminatory behavior." She gathered her documents with careful precision, each movement calculated to demonstrate her complete control over the situation. "The merger vote is scheduled for next Tuesday. I'll be making my recommendation to the board this afternoon." The transformation in the room was complete. Where once Margaret had been treated as a problem to be managed, she was now recognized as the solution to a crisis that threatened the airline's very existence. Harrison and Reeves stood awkwardly, uncertain of protocol when the person they had been interrogating turned out to be the most important individual in their company's future. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had been completely inverted, revealing the hollow nature of their earlier authority. "Mrs. Thompson," Harrison said, his voice now carrying the desperate edge of someone pleading for mercy, "is there anything we can do to—" Margaret held up her hand again, the gesture now carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence, "you've already done everything you needed to do. You've shown me exactly who you are when you think no one important is watching. And that, unfortunately for your airline, is all I needed to see." The revelation was complete, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold across the corporate landscape, like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The aftermath of Margaret's revelation rippled through the airline industry like shockwaves from a seismic event, proving that true justice doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet authority of consequences. Within 72 hours, every staff member who had participated in her systematic exclusion found themselves reassigned to domestic routes, stripped of their international privileges and premium cabin assignments. Sloane Carter, who had served cold meals while others received warm plates, now worked short-haul flights to Cleveland and Milwaukee, her first-class service days a distant memory. The gate agents who had questioned Margaret's boarding pass discovered their access to executive terminals permanently revoked, relegated to processing economy passengers at regional gates. The $4.1 billion merger hung in the balance for exactly 1 week before Margaret signed the authorization, but not without implementing sweeping compliance requirements that would reshape how the airline treated every passenger, regardless of appearance or assumption. Her decision demonstrated a profound truth that resonates deeply with those who have lived long enough to understand power's many faces. Dignity maintained in silence often speaks louder than voices raised in protest. The airline's stock price fluctuated wildly during those 7 days, reminding Wall Street that in an interconnected economy, treating people with basic respect isn't just moral, it's financially essential. Margaret's story became a quiet legend in corporate circles, not because she sought revenge, but because she wielded authority with the measured wisdom of someone who understood that lasting change comes through strategic action, not emotional reaction. She had learned what many discover only with age, that the most powerful response to discrimination isn't always confrontation. Sometimes it's simply allowing people to reveal who they truly are when they think no one important is watching. What moment in Margaret's journey resonated most deeply with your own experiences of being underestimated or overlooked? Have you ever witnessed the quiet power of dignity triumph over prejudice? Share your thoughts in the comments below, hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe for more powerful narratives that remind us why respect should never depend on assumptions. Your perspective matters. Let's build a community of wisdom together.